I would like to do something a little different today. Since we last met, the world has been turned upside down by the tragic violence in the Middle East. We have already seen the ongoing war in Ukraine and many crises elsewhere. To many people, including me, it seems like 9/11 all over again. What comes to mind is the famous quote, peace is only an armistice in an endless war, often attributed or misattributed to Thucydides, the ancient Greek writer. I wanted to take a step back this week and through some key quotations from important thinkers and writers, quotations that have almost become aphorisms or epigraphs, given how powerful they are, to take stock of where we are in the world today. I think we need to reflect on where we are today, our current global crisis. So that's the agenda, and much of what I'm going to say relates either directly or indirectly to the broader themes of these courses uh, on economic development or political economy in the modern state. After my remarks, I'm going to set up a special lecture, which I will screen after the break in the classroom. Just a final note, you will not be examined on the material in the first half of the course today, but if you want to delve deeper into it or get details on the quotations I refer to, for example, please drop by my office hours or drop me an email. For today's class, I do have prepared notes for the first half. As I have quotes I want to render very precisely, the notes at present are rather rough, and I will try to tidy them up over the break, the reading week next week. After that, I would be happy to share them. Again, please drop a line or drop by. I start with a quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silenced. This must be silent. Let me repeat that. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This is from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of Wittgenstein's epochal work from 1922, often considered the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Here he echoes the Buddha on the limits of human knowledge and on our ultimate knowledge or knowledge of ultimate reality. Some call it God or the divine. If such a thing exists, it cannot be spoken about with the rational mind, but only suggested, for example, through metaphor, art, literature, or music. Here's an example some of you might recognize, the poem I'm quoting from. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement. And do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where. And I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. That's a quotation from Burnt Norton by T.S. Eliot, which became part of his four quartets, written in 1936. The four quartets appeared in 1943. Eliot prefaces the poem with two epigraphs from Heraclitus, or the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, who flourished in the 5th century BC. You probably know him through the well-known aphorisms, everything flows or is in flux, and you cannot step into the same river twice. I will not read the original classical Greek for you. If you wish, I could share it with you. Just drop me a line. But these two aphorisms translate roughly as the first: though wisdom is common, the many live as if they have wisdom of their own. And that's what we seem to describe our present moment. The second translates as the way upward and the way downward is one and the same. And you can see how that's reflected in the lines I read you from T.S. Eliot. And there are other examples in art, literature, and music of the possible transcendence that we can achieve, or at least strive for, that eludes rational utterance. I would suggest, for example, in music, the aria that begins the Goldberg Variations by Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. That aria, seemingly simple, contains an entire universe of meaning and emotion. The other, I would suggest, perhaps, is the prelude to Richard Wagner's last opera, Parsifal, based on the legend of the Holy Grail. It's, at least for me, perhaps the most mystical music of all in the Western classical canon. But let me move on. I turn next to a quotation from Antonio Gramsci. I'll read it first for you in Italian and then read the translation in English. La crisi consiste appunto nel fatto che il vecchio muore e il nuovo non può nascere. In questo interregno al verificano i fenomeni morbosi più svariati. That's from the prison notebooks that Gramsci wrote in 1929, and it translates as follows. This is a fairly literal translation, not especially elegant, but captures the meaning of the quote. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old dies and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, the most varied morbid phenomena occur. And he was writing this at the time of the rise of fascism. He was one of the most influential Marxist theorists of the 20th century. And I think this quote it applies at least as much to our time as it does at the time when Gramsci wrote this in the 1930s. He was, I should say that he was imprisoned by the fascists. He wrote these prison notebooks over the span of 1929 to 1935 approximately. And he died in prison in 1937. And the notebooks were smuggled out of prison and finally published in 1947 after the end of the war. He was writing this work at the time that European civilization was disintegrating under the twin assaults of fascism and Soviet-style communism. But it seems to me equally applicable at other crisis points, such as after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, after 9/11, and at our present moment, which I say, for many of us, feels like another 9/11. Gramsci's point is that in this interregnum, we see many morbid symptoms, which today include terrorism, war, the crisis in liberal democracy, global inequality, the climate crisis, and one can go on and on. I turn next to a quote from Walter Benjamin. I'm going to read the first sentence for you in German and then read the entire quote in English. Es ist niemals ein Dokument der Kultur, ohne zugleich ein solches der Barbarei zu sein. And that very famous line translates as, there has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. And here's the rest of the quote in English. And just as it is itself not free from barbarism, neither is it free from the process of transmission in which it falls from one set of hands into another. The historical materialist thus moves as far away from this as measurably possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain. And this is from the theses on the history of, on the philosophy of history, rather, that appeared, that rather Benjamin wrote in 1940. Walter Benjamin was a leading German Jewish intellectual, writer and theologian. He was trying to escape Nazi Germany and was waiting to cross from France into Spain. He finished the essay and mailed it to Hannah Arendt, another important German Jewish scholar who managed to escape and made it to the US, where she had a very major academic career. She's probably best known to laypersons for coining the term the banality of evil to describe the horrors of the Nazi regime. Alas, Benjamin couldn't get across to Spain, and in 1942, in a state of despair, he committed suicide. The essay was published after his death and after the war, obviously. Like Wittgenstein, this essay is rather aphoristic. He seems to be saying in this very ambiguous and difficult passage that any object of culture, when it is transmitted, is tainted by barbarism in some way. Elsewhere, Benjamin wrote extensively on transmission of culture and translation. And this could apply, for example, to translation when you translate an idea or a passage from one language to another, for example. In that act of cultural transmission and translation, there's also an element of barbarism that you can't really do justice to what is said with all of its nuance in one language in translation in another. And that is true of several of these quotes that I myself am reading you in translation right now. I will give you one example. When I was in Berlin in 1929, I had occasion to visit the house of the Wannsee Conference. This was the house in a wealthy lakeside suburb of Berlin, where senior Nazi officials met to discuss the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. This was literally the meeting that planned the Holocaust, the Shoah, and all the horrors that followed. And you can see photographs of this villa and the surrounding area and the lakeside. I visited on a lovely sunny summer day in June. You could see people having picnics by the lakeside. There's a restaurant with a terrace where you can have some food and drink and look out over the lake. You can see sailboats on the lake. The house itself is a beautiful 19th century villa with a lovely garden and view of the lake. For a long time after the war, it was just shuttered. The Germans didn't quite know how to deal with it. In the end, it was turned into a museum so people could see where this terrible chapter in their history was literally written, and it serves that purpose even today. But it's a very strange experience to visit it. There's a real cognitive dissonance between the lovely house and surroundings and the heinous crimes that were conceived there. Any sensitive visitors left feeling very uneasy, a sense of malaise. The same feeling I had when I visited Dachau, the concentration camp, which is also now a museum, quite a few years ago. So perhaps this is one way of understanding what Benjamin, what Walter Benjamin was trying to get at in this notion of barbarism in the transmission of culture. Now I turn next to a quotation from the great French theorist Michel Foucault. This is from a 1979 essay for an ethic of discomfort, and here I will read you just the English translation, not the French original. We are witnessing a globalization of the economy, quite possibly. A globalization of political calculations, without a doubt. But a globalization of political consciousness, certainly not. And again, Foucault was a highly influential theorist, along with Jacques Derrida, probably the most influential French thinker, possibly of the last century. And Foucault realized earlier than most, the quote was from 1979, the contradiction or the paradox at the heart of globalization. We have a globalization of trade in goods, services, technology, and most importantly, financial capital, but not of people, either as labor or as migrants, creating an asymmetry that feeds massive inequalities of wealth and income and well-being within countries of the global south, within countries of the north, and between them. The present migrant crisis in the Americas and Europe on the southern borders of the rich countries is only the most visible symptom. In other words, the crisis is a symptom of this large syndrome, while it is itself a cause of crises in both sending and receiving countries as they affect the politics. It's also a symptom of the fact that while important facets of the global economy have been globalized, politics is not. It is still almost entirely national. That is even true in the EU, where, for example, the war in Ukraine and the migrant crisis have created major rifts between members, with, for example, border controls being reimposed on the eastern borders of the EU, for example, by Austria, to prevent migrants coming via Turkey and the Balkans, which in fact violates the freedom of movement that is one of the 4 freedoms of the EU that is moving within the EU. But even those barriers are being reimposed to try and stem the flow of migrants. Now, I would like to conclude these remarks by setting up the special lecture I will show after the break. Again, this is for my students in class. Akhil Bilgrami is a person I want to have speak to you via one of his pre-recorded lectures. Akhil is one of the premier philosophers in the world today. He has many intellectual interests. But what concerns us here is his work on what he calls the moral psychology of politics. Akhil, who happens to be a friend, was born in Bombay, as was I, and studied English in Bombay before winning a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he did a PPE, and then a PhD in philosophy at Chicago, and now has been a long time Columbia University professor of philosophy, where he worked closely with the late Edward Said and with, for example, the economist Joe Stiglitz in setting up a group to study matters of global thought and concern. Now, I want to speak a little bit about his lecture, which is entitled Alternative Modernities, A View from the South. He gave this talk at Cornell University about 10 years ago, and it's available on YouTube. But if at all more relevant now than when he gave it, it's available, as I said, for you to watch or rewatch, and a version of it was published in a book of essays that came out, I think, in 2014. Again, which is not hard for you to find. If you want more information, though, on his writing and his more recent books and essays, again, please drop a line or drop by office hours. Now, why am I showing you this lecture? Because thus far we have been staying within more or less the confines of what one might call a classical liberal Anglo-American tradition of thought. As we've seen both in the book by Martin Wolf and in class discussion, this tradition emphasizes economic liberty and political liberty, giving rise to both market-based capitalism and democracy. And part of this tradition is also in a line that runs from John Locke through Hume, Smith, Mill, and others, right up to Robert Nozick. And in this approach, we posit a state of nature. And that concept goes back to Hobbes, at least. That goes back even earlier. And then a social contract is created, which creates both individual liberty and, in theory, a promise of equality or at least equal access, crucially supported by the rule of law and institutions that guarantee security, as I said, and importantly, create the institutions of private property and enforcement of contract, without which you can't have markets or capitalism, or arguably even democracy. Thus far, we've taken this as our main framework for analysis. looking at, for example, the debate on what should fall within the domain of the state and what should fall under the domain of the market, themes that we have talked about on and off throughout the course. But we have not so far ventured very far out of this classical liberal framework, something that's important for us to do, I think. Right from the Enlightenment, there have been radical critiques of this tradition, and that is what Belgrami explores in this very rich and thoughtful lecture. Unlike many in the academy, in both humanities and social sciences, he steers clear of unnecessary jargon and uses ordinary but very precise and beautiful language to express his thoughts. Having said that, if you're not used to hearing a lecture in philosophy, you might find it a bit challenging. So to help you, I wanted to highlight very briefly his main arguments, so you are better prepared for the lecture after the break. Again, this is from my in-class students. Belgrami begins with a reference to Edward Said, perhaps the most important cultural theorist of the latter half of the last century, and his classic book, Orientalism, on how the West, or what we now call the North, has had and still has in many ways a distorted understanding of the East, of what used to be called the East or the Orient, or what is now we call the Global South, and often does so for self-serving ends such as commerce and empire. Belgrami turns that around here and asks, what do the ideas of the North look like when viewed from the South? Is there a critique of those ideas coming from the South that resonates with existing critiques from those in the intellectual history of the North who dissented from the orthodox views of classical liberalism and its offshoots? He calls these alternative modernities. How would the South look at the two most fundamental principles of orthodox modernity, liberty and equality? Such an observer would notice that these two fundamental principles, as they have been elaborated since the Enlightenment, are often fundamentally contradictory in practice, even if they have equal weight in theory. In particular, unconstrained liberty invariably creates large inequalities, and likewise, if you prioritize equality, that necessarily impinges on liberty. So Belgrami elaborates on this contradiction, or this paradox, again, at the heart of classical liberalism. He suggests a critique from the South, matching critiques from the North, from those who dissented, in which liberty and equality are no longer the twin fundamental principles of modernity, but are replaced by what he calls a more primitive concept, primitive that is in the sense of being more fundamental to culture, society, and politics. That concept is a life devoid of the alienation that is a common feature in the North. What are the sources of such alienation? How and when did we in the North, and in many parts of the South as well, that share the value systems of the North, move from a world that we lived in to a world that we wanted to master and control? What is faulty with the classical liberal social contract idea as both a positive, that is, a descriptive and normative theory from the point of view of this critique? In particular, contract theory says that moving from the state of nature to the contract, the social contract, makes everyone better off, or at least no one worse off, the classic Pareto principle. Belgrami challenges this with an alternative counterfactual. Now, this really is the conceptual crux of the lecture, so please do pay careful attention when he comes to this part, I think so approximately midway through his lecture. Next, he discusses how the North moved from the idea of a state based on the divine right of kings, a concept which became untenable after the Enlightenment and the rise of the new science, to a rationale for the Westphalian nation state, where the nation, a concept which had never existed before, was coupled with the power of the state. The Anglo-Irish political theorist Benedict Anderson has famously referred to the rationale for the nation state as imagined communities in his famous book of the same title. On this view, the nation is a sort of fiction, stories we tell ourselves that creates an emotional tie to the nation, nationalism, which thereby justifies the power of the state over its citizens and its territory. And through history, one of the main methods to create nationalism has been to define an external enemy in one's midst, usually a vulnerable minority, the other, to make the majority feel invested in the nation state and reject this outsider, this other, and to buttress the nation state, this new entity. The method was perfected, if that's the word, and taken to its horrific and genocidal logical conclusion by the National Socialists in Germany, and it has happened elsewhere, even in our own times. Bilgrami observes that the language of rights is used by the power elite in the North as a form of deception and even self-deception, whereby rights exist only in civilized, again, these words are all in scare quotes, only in the civilized North and not in the barbaric or cruel South. There's an echo in this argument of the civilizing mission and the white man's burden, again, all of this in scare quotes, that was the supposed rationale of the enterprise of empire in the 19th century, whose real purpose, of course, was loot, plunder, and the enrichment of the North. Furthermore, Bilgrami argues, the natural world has been evacuated of value, whether divine or secular, and becomes a site for the exploitation of natural resources and for study by the natural sciences, no longer a place where human beings can live. Bilgrami concludes his talk by theorizing about what a life devoid of alienation, in particular to nature and society, might look like. His answer is that such a life must be in normative sync, in quotes, this is his term, normative sync, with the value properties of nature and society. And how does one do this? What does this look like? He argues that we need to develop a realization that, I quote, nobody in a society or group is well off if someone is badly off. I'll again repeat that we have to come to this realization that nobody in a society or group is well off if someone is badly off. An ideal well understood in many folk and spiritual traditions in the global South and also even in the North. Even those who are apparently well off in a situation of inequality are not in fact so, but feel a social sense of alienation and malaise. And again, I can only say that those of us who live in the center of Ottawa or live in Lower Town experience that dislocation, that malaise every day, just walking around our city and many places in the global north of the North. I often walk down Rideau Street in the market and see people huddled in corners and doorways, someone sleeping on the vent coming up from the O train because there's some heat coming up. So on a cold day, that heat rising from the vent and some kind of blanket keeps someone warm. And we're already only now in October where temperatures are already getting cold at night. But people are suffering. And so even those of us who are well off in society, when we experience that, there's a sense of malaise, alienation that I think, where I think he's absolutely right. And that permeates our society, criticizing the paradigm of rational self-interest, what one is actually promoting is a richer conception of liberty in some collective sense. And that's how Belgrami concludes his lecture, which I, again, for my students here in the classroom, I'm going to be showing you after the break, but I'm going to end here for the first part of the lecture. And thank you very much for watching or seeing this in the classroom. Thank you for your attention.